Okay, welcome everybody. We're very privileged to have Mark Peterson, the renowned professor here, to give us a presentation today. And Mark, I'm going to turn the stage over to you.
Thank you, and thanks for the privilege of being an honorary K1 for a little while. I know so many of you. I see Ed and Diane there, and David and Ann. We're missing Ned. He sent me a note that he had some research to do on the Big Island. Huh. And Ed Klein, it's nice to see you. Ed, I don't know if you and I have talked since I met your daughter in Missouri a few years ago. Did you know about that?
That's right. She called me up and she says, "Do you know Mark Peterson?" I said, "Yeah, I mean, you should know him too, because, you know, she was with us. 3 of our kids were with us when we were in Sagang." And yeah, so she rambled on and was very impressed with your presentation. Were you in Springfield or?
I don't think I think it was in Columbia.
Yeah. Okay.
And it was somewhere in Missouri, and Missouri State Social Science something or other asked me to do a gig on Korea, and she came up to me afterward and she said, "I think I know you. You know my dad, Ed Klein?" "Oh yeah, I know your dad, sure." And so we took a picture and reminisced for just a little. So anyway, it's nice to see you all, and I feel a good connection with so many of you. Bob Baskerville, you and I played basketball out at Seoul Foreign School when you were doing a law gig there with Kim and Chong, right? Yeah. Well, it's good to see you all. What I want to do today, I'm particularly happy to talk to this group. Oh, and Carl, I didn't recognize you last time. Carl, you're an honorary K1 as well, right? You're not a real K1?
No, he's not.
That's right. I'm not a real K1. I'm a guest, and I've been hanging around on the bi-monthly presentations since Ned Schultz invited me in a few months ago. And the price of entry was doing a presentation.
I'd like to be an interloper like you as well, honorary K1. Well, what I want to do today is, and I'm really happy to talk with this group because you know Korea in a general or a specific sort of way, and I want to share with you my journey through Korean history and how I've developed some ideas that have diverged from the standard point of view of Korean history. And it's been an interesting journey because as I started my journey, I wanted to be an orthodox, mainline Korean historian. I didn't want to offend Koreans by telling them something different about their history, because I'd made presentations where some graduate students would raise their hand and say, "Yeah, I think you've been influenced by the Japanese. This isn't the way we do it." And you run into that sort of thing, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be a good boy and tell the Orthodox story the way any good Korean would do it. Well, there's some real problems with the Orthodox story. And as time has gone by, I've come to diverge, and somewhere maybe around the ceremonial 60th birthday, I decided to let it rip and tell it the way I saw it and let the chips fall where they may. Well, the chips have fallen in line very nicely, and people like what I have to say, even though I'm telling them basically they've got their whole story backwards. And that's basically what I'm going to talk about today. Is the Korean history story is 180 degrees wrong. And as I tell that story, and some of you have inklings of parts of that story, like the 5,000-year history, give me a break, and other sorts of things, you have an inkling that the Orthodox story is not quite right, but you go along with it, and at conferences, someone stands up and say something, 5,000 years history, something. I remember looking over at different friends and we kind of, eye roll. Here we go again. But I'm not going to look about the 5,000 years, but I'm going to look at a bunch of other things. And what has happened is, since I retired, I've become an active YouTuber. And here's my trophy right here. I've got 100,000 subscribers. Actually, I have 136,000 subscribers now. I make money, but I lose money because I spend more on production costs than I do on income. And I'm at a level of viewership where, well, I haven't done my taxes. I need to do for last year, but the year before last, I made about $6,500 on YouTube, and I spent about 8,000. So I was minus about 1,500. And for a hobby, 1,500 to spend on your hobby is a heck of a lot less than you spend on golf or a lot of other dumb things. So I consider it a good hobby, but more than a hobby, I feel like I've got a message. And when I wrote my dissertation up and had it published at Cornell, I wanted it to come out in Korean. So I worked at getting it translated so it would come out in Korean. Well, I think there were 38 people that read it. And and then there's YouTube out there. And I all of a sudden decided that if you want to get your point of view out, writing a book is not the way to do it. But YouTube is the way to do it. So I've become a very active YouTuber. There you go, Frank. You got the word right there. And so I decided I have a message, and that Koreans ought to hear the message. And if Koreans hear the message, and if it works the way I think it should, it will move the needle. That's the phrase I've been using. I want to move the needle. I want to move the direction in which Korean history is going. And I'm not the lone voice in the wilderness. A lot of younger scholars are coming across some of the same ideas, and we're not voices in the wilderness, but we're not just revisionist historians, but we're looking at history in a whole new way. And the way I view it is this: if you don't study history, if you don't write history, if you're a ordinary person, let's say, you think of history as a solid object out there, and somebody goes and looks at it and writes a book about this part of it and comes back, and somebody else writes about this part of it, and there's another book, and they're all perspectives on this solid object out there called history. That's not true. History is not a solid object. Things happened, but how we interpret them is a different matter. And history is more like a liquid. It's not a gas. It's more like a liquid, in that it takes the shape of the container that it's in. And the container that Korean history is in today is Korea 2022, which is very different from the Korea you all knew as Korea 1966. Korea 1966, that container was a poor, beaten up, victimized container for history. And history came out poor, victimized, and beaten up. Well, Korea is no longer victimized, and Korea is no longer beaten up. And there's a different way of looking at Korea now. And so that's what I started to look at. And I've made a, let's see, did you make me host so I can share screen? Looks like
Everybody can share, Mark.
Oh, really? You're a very sharing group, huh?
Oh yeah. K1.
Let's see, where'd my page go? There it is, right there. So what I've come up with is this list of, I started off with a top 10 list. David Letterman top 10 list of unique features of Korean history that I think documents the idea that Korean history is not the beat up, picked on, 고래 싸움에 새우등 터진다 하는 역사는 아닙니다. And I wrote a top 10 list, and then I thought about it and add 12 more. And now I have the 12 pillars. And I've done a video well, I've done several videos on all of these, my YouTube, and I'm going to talk to you. I'll come back to that screen from time to time, but and talk about my top 10 and my top 12. But I'd like to look at this to see you all as I'm talking. Yeah, so as I started into this thing, I started thinking, well, what are the indicators that Korea really is more of a stable place? Korea is really more of a peaceful place than most people would think, at least contemporary Koreans would think. And the story that you all got when you were in Korea was, oh, we're picked on and, you know, been invaded by a gajillion times by a gajillion different countries and all this sort of nonsense. So I started looking at different aspects of this peaceful Korea. And the first thing on that list was long dynasties. Now, during the Japanese era, the long dynasties thing was derided. And long dynasties are a bad thing, don't you know, from a Japanese perspective. Why? We Japanese have short dynasties. They're dynamic. And as soon as they run out of gas, we get ourselves a new dynasty and a new bunch of people in there. And you Koreans are stodgy, inept, corrupt. These long dynasties are not a good thing. And unfortunately, most Koreans have bought into that idea. And the idea is, if only Korea would have changed dynasties at the Hideyoshi invasion, and been a more energetic and a whole new dynasty to go forward after that. I don't buy that at all. I think that Korea's uniqueness is in its longevity and its stable dynasties. So the long dynasties, and this is really a unique thing, you know. I mean, if you've studied any other world history, certainly if you look at the Japanese, Korea has the Shilla dynasty that lasted 1,000 years, right? And yeah, there was a mythological beginning, but still you got a lot of time in there. Koryo lasted nearly 500 and Chosun lasted over 500. You don't find other countries in the world that have even one 500 dynasty. All around the world, Europe, Middle East, China, Japan, a dynasty runs 150 to 250 years on average. And a dynasty has a sort of a lifespan. It's like a human organism. And humans live 80 to 100 years, right? We're all getting closer. And if you run into a 200-year-old man, whoa, that's a really different thing. Well, that's what these 500-year dynasties are like. It's like you're running into someone that's twice as old as anybody else you ever ran into. And this is not a bad thing. This is a good thing in my point of view. I'm going to do a judgmental thing on this. Okay, that's number one, long dynasties. Number two, I'll come back to that list again later if you want to see it. Number two on the list is smooth transitions from dynasty to dynasty. And this too has been denigrated by the Japanese era historians who have said that from dynasty to dynasty, we've had this revolution, this turning over of personnel and a whole new start. Baloney. Each of these dynasties were a continuation of the previous dynasty. They were not turnover. You hear this all the time, and it's you know, the stages of history, you know, and this marks a new stage of history. And if Koreans said, oh no, we don't have these stages, then they're denying the progress that the Japanese or whoever said you should be showing. You see, you should have a revolution and move from the feudal stage to the capitalist stage and onward like this. Well, no, you have smooth transitions. The Koryo to the Chosun dynasty, for example, was not revolutionary. I just did a video on this on my YouTube. Oh, I keep plugging my YouTube channel. I'm not doing it for money. If you all go out and watch 20 videos, so 20 times 20, that 400 videos. If you watch 400 videos, I will make 40 cents. That's the payout on it. So y'all hurry, go watch a lot of videos, make me some money, okay? Well, I've done a video on the smooth transition from dynasties. I did one recently on the Wang family of Koryo were not annihilated. And when I've posted things about the smooth transitions from dynasty to dynasties, a lot of my commentators, the thing that's fun about YouTube is you get these comments from people. And it's really fun because they say some of the most interesting things that show these different perspectives that they have on their own history and culture. And I got a lot of people who said, oh, no, they annihilated the Wangshi. It was a huge revolution. So I did a video saying, no, not so. One element of the Wangshi were eliminated, actually 2 lines of the Wangshi. One was exiled to Koje Island and were later executed. One were exiled to Kanghua Island and were later executed. But a number of the Wangshi lived on. In fact, there were 2 members of the Wang family that were Kegu Gongshin, founding fathers of the Chosun dynasty. So they're right in bed with Isangye right to begin with. And Isangye and his clique were basically the same guys that were ruling Korea in the Koryo dynasty. They're the same bunch of guys. Where is it? John Duncan. Help me, John Duncan, where are you? Here you are. John Duncan tabulates that fairly well when he talks about the continuity between Koryo and Chosun. So if it was true between Koryo and Chosun, what about between Shilla and Koryo? Well, Hu Goguryo, that became Koryo, of course, fought against Hu Pekje and was a protector of Shilla. Once they eliminated Hu Pekje, the aristocracy of Shilla joined with Wanggun, and a lot of the Gyeongju folks moved up to Kaesong. And I'll talk about the evidence for this a little bit later on. So you really have a relatively smooth transition from Shilla to Koryo as well. And it goes back to the first transition we can document is the Kaya to Shilla transition. And the Kaya kingdom was not annihilated, but the last Kaya king surrendered to Shilla and became part of the Shilla aristocracy. And you remember that Shilla has the Kolpumje, the bone rank system, this very, very hierarchical, almost pre-caste kind of system. Where do the Kaya people end up? Right at the top. The Kaya king became a member of the Chingol class. And this was right at the time when the Sungol class was dying out. So Chingol was as high as you get. You remember Kim Yushin, who is heralded as the unifying general of the Shilla dynasty. Kim Yushin was the one that conquered Pekje, conquered Koguryo. Kim Yushin was the Hwarang knight, together with Kim Chunchu, leaders of the Hwarang knight group, and Kim Chunchu went on to become the king. Well, one of the parts we don't talk about a lot, it's in the Korean history. Most Koreans know this, but Americans don't know this detail so much, that Kim Yushin's sister married Kim Chunchu. And so you've got a Kaya Chingol marrying right to the top level of the Shilla aristocracy. Not only did Kim Yushin's sister marry Kim Chunchu, but they had a daughter. And this daughter married whom? Kim Yushin, her uncle, her Wesamchon. So when I mention this to Korean audiences, they go, Jinguropta. And marrying your uncle is about as Jinguropta as you can be. But that was the way it was in those days, because the Chingol was a very narrow class at the top of the pinnacle. And you know, like a lot of aristocracies, they only marry cousins or uncle, niece. And so it shows that Kaya survived within Shilla. It was not annihilated. I'll come back to this toward the end when I get to point number 10. So we've got a rather smooth transition from Kaya to Shilla, from Shilla to Koryo, and from Koryo to Chosun. Martina Deuchler says, the way she looks at it is that there was basically one aristocracy that continued throughout 1500 years of this history, 15 to 17 to 1800 years, one aristocracy. The aristocracy of Shilla, Sorabol, remember Sorabol, the 6 villages of Sorabol that give us the names Yi and Che and Chung, and in addition to the royalty of Pak and Kim. these are prominent names in Korea today that go back to Shilla times. Now, not all transitions were smooth. We mentioned the destruction of Paekje. Paekje was annihilated. No fun and games with those folks. The aristocracy of Paekje, there were 8 surnames that we know of from the aristocracy of Paekje, completely gone from Korea today. Not like the Sorobol names that live on today, but like the names of Paekje show up in China and in Japan. And those folks had relations with China and with Japan, and they took off. Either that or to face annihilation. So the smooth transition did not work for Paekje and did not work for Kogyo. A few of Kogyo names survive, but it was mostly annihilated as well by the Shilla unification. Okay, so we've got relatively smooth transitions and one aristocracy running from Shilla through Kogyo through Chosun, okay? Long dynasties and smooth transition between dynasties. Point number 3 is no or not that many invasions. Now this one really wrangles a lot of Koreans. Get in the taxi and what you doing in Korea? You know, I'm a Korean historian. Oh, our history, we've had so many invasions. You know, it's just automatic. So many invasions. I call BS on it. Korea has really not had that many invasions. Now, this is really jarring to your ears if you're used to the invasion story. But let me put it this way. I met a fellow once, a retired high school teacher who took it on himself to chronicle all the invasions. And he went through every Moonjeep and every Yasa and every text of the whole Shillok and tabulated every invasion that he could find. And he had 900 invasions. What kind of attitude is this? What kind of chungshin is it to say, look how we've been so picked on. Look how we are the doormat of all nations of the world. We have the world's record of number of invasions. Well, what kind of invasions were these? To count 900, you're counting a pirate raid on the East Coast. You're counting a Japanese pirate ship that comes in, steals a bag of rice, grabs a pig, maybe kidnaps a maiden, you know, pirates, and they sail off into the into the East Sea until they get to the Sea of Japan, and there's an invasion. Well, if the quality of invasion is the issue, which I'm saying it is, and if these pirate raids are not going to count as an invasion, what does count? Well, the Hideyoshi invasion was horrendous. And to count all these piddly-dink little invasions as just another invasion denigrates the tremendous destruction that the Hideyoshi invasion was. At that point, between 2 million and 4 million people died. And it was one of the worst world wars in the history of the world up to that point. It was just horrendous. The destruction of property, the way the Japanese went through the Korean Peninsula and just killed and slaughtered and stole and destroyed everything, killed everything. It was just horrific. Well, that was a real invasion. So on that scale, how many invasions are there? 1. How many invasions are there close to that? 2. The Mongol invasion killed roughly 1 million people. They think between 1 million and 2 million. And the Mongol invasion lasted for 30 years. The Koreans held on. And the Mongol invasion ended when the Koreans worked out a system with them where the Mongols would recognize Korea as a Pumaguk, a son-in-law kingdom, and intermarried with the royal kingdom, but kept the king on the throne. So those are the 2 major invasions. And I very often say to Korean groups, there have only been 2 real invasions. And the response immediately is, oh, what about the Manchus? What about the 1627, 1636, the Byangja Horan and the Cheongmyo Horan and Byangja Horan? Those are very, very different. The Manchus came into Korea to make Korea an ally as they marched in to destroy the Ming Dynasty. It was a humiliation, especially the second invasion, because the first invasion they came in and the king says, okay, we'll recognize the Qing Dynasty. You Manchus, yeah, you're tough. You're the boys. Okay, we recognize you guys. And then Korea went backdoor across the ocean over to Ming and said, hey, the Qing have forced us into this. We don't like to be recognized. We don't want to recognize them. Let's attack. And that was the famous Bukbo. But Korea was so beat up from the Hideyoshi invasion, and China was beat up from the Hideyoshi invasion. Nobody could get their act together to Bukbo, to attack the north. And the Manchus found out about it in 1636 and came back again and said, all right, we made you kneel to us before. Now you're going to kneel to us again. This time we're taking your 3 sons as hostages to make sure you're not going to do anything funny. And they left. They did not go through this countryside slaughtering people the way the Mongols and the Japanese did. There was one army general that went on a rampage and went into one village and slaughtered and all of this. And he was immediately relieved from command. And the Manchus said, that's not what this game is. The Koreans are our ally. So those 2 invasions were invasions. Okay, they were invasions. I'll give you that if you want. But they were very different from these 2 major invasions. So point number 3 is to reevaluate this whole idea of invasions. I have a student that'll come to me every now and again. I say, what do I want to do your paper on? Oh, I've been thinking about doing it on the Japanese invasion. Okay, what do you think about doing it? And they start talking about 1910. And I say, Yobaseo, there was no invasion in 1910. Where were the ships that landed? Who was the commander? Where was the battle? There was none of that. The Japanese takeover in 1910 was very subtle. They had fought the Chinese on Korean soil. They had fought the Russians on Korean waters, but they hadn't fought the Koreans. They came across to the Koreans. They had learned their lesson from Hideyoshi being the bad guy. Like Russia and Ukraine today. I mean, you just can't, think of that stuff going on in Ukraine today, and you think of the way the Japanese picked on the Koreans. But in 1910, it was a very subtle takeover with cooperation of the Chinilpa, the collaborators in Korea, and there were a lot of them. So this idea of invasion, I downplay the whole shtick, especially after the Shilla unification. Before the Shilla unification, you do have the 3 kingdoms fighting each other, and you do have Kogyo fighting against Sui and Tang from China. And point number 4 is Korea never invaded another country. And some people say, oh, no, wait a minute, Kogyo invaded China. And there was a famous battle where Kogyo went up against China. But my argument is post-Shilla unification. To my point of view, that's when Korea became Korea, okay? And before that, yeah, there was a lot of chaos and turmoil. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to point number 9 ahead here in a minute. So point number 3 was there were not that many invasions. Point number 4 is Korea never invaded another country. I remember sitting down with Gukjang, the Director General level at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with a dinner one time in Insadong. And I just happened to mention to him, this is when I was Fulbright director, I happened to mention that Korea had never invaded another country. And I thought that was a great thing. How many countries can claim they've never invaded another country? And the Director General slumped down and shoulders slumped and he bowed his head. Yeah, we're so weak, we never invaded another country. And I thought it was just so laughable that it takes that perspective on this. I think this is something that Korea should be proud of. Point number 5. I got this from David Kong. Do you know David Kong at USC? Great guy. His mother was Hildy Kong, who wrote Under the Black Umbrella, one of the few Anglo-Americans, one of the first Anglo-American women to marry a Korean guy. Anyway, David's a great scholar, and one of his presentations, he talked about the Amnokang, the Yalu River, as a boundary between Korea and China, or before that, the Khitan, or before the Jurchens, the Manchu people, that the Yalu River has been a boundary for 1,000 years. You cannot find a 1,000-year boundary anywhere else on the planet. There are interesting maps on YouTube. You've probably seen them where you can see the boundaries of Europe changing over time. Have you seen that video where Germany and France and all the boundaries of Europe are just moving all over the place year by year by year. Not so with the Yalu River. It's probably the oldest, longest serving national boundary on the planet. So that's point number 5 of stability of the Korean political unit, the Korean society. Point number 6. This is a fun story. I like to tell this story. For several years, I worked with the Academy of Korean Studies on trying to improve American textbooks, especially world history, about Korea. And we took seminars to Korea and did a field trip, fact-finding, help these textbook writers, textbook publishers, textbook editors to learn more about and to write more about Korea accurately. Well, I was standing in front of the Orung, you know, the Orung, the 5 tombs in Gyeongju, the oldest of all the tombs in Gyeongju. There are several clusters of tombs. This is supposedly the oldest. This is where Park Hyuk-kose himself, the founder of Shilla, is supposedly buried. And there are 5 tombs there. And I was standing in front of the 5 tombs and talking about Hyuk-kose and the tombs and all this. And in this group on this day, one of the textbook writers was an archaeologist. And he raised his hand. He said, Professor Peterson, when were these tombs robbed? And I said, well, no, these tombs haven't been robbed. And he said, well, sure they have. That's what they do. You know, that I'm an archaeologist. That's what they do. They rob tombs. And I said, and I had with me Professor Lee Jong-uk of Sogang, who's a specialist in Shilla history. And he said, no, these tombs haven't been robbed. And I said, when the archaeologists have gotten into the 7, 8 tombs that they've excavated, I think there are 7. One was a double tomb. So sometimes they say 7, sometimes they say 8. These tombs that they've excavated, when they get into them, they find the gold crown, they find all the gold, and everything's there. The tomb robbers have not taken it. And this archaeologist says, wow, that's amazing. This is in the Middle East. We never find a tomb that hasn't been robbed. The pyramids of Egypt were robbed before the dynasty was over. And he says, if you've got tombs that haven't been robbed, and then he looked at me and said, you know, I've been telling this group about the peaceful tradition of Korean history. He said, this is a pretty good piece of evidence that Korea's had some peaceful history if there was never enough chaos to rob the tombs. That's point number 6. Point number 7 is civilian control of the government. And the best contrast with this is Japan. Japan's history has been the history of the samurai, right? And the dynamic change of dynasties, and one samurai group gets sick of the last samurai group and take over, and we have a new samurai group and a new daimyo who controls things and controls the emperor. They never change the emperor, he's always there, but the real power is in the hand of these, you know, the Ashikaga shogunate, the Kamakura shogunate, all this stuff. If you look at Korea, where are the samurai? And when I was a younger man, I sort of felt bad that Korea didn't have samurai. You know, oh, we got Isun Shin, yeah, there's Isun Shin. You know, where are the samurai? No, Korea. The way you recruit people to serve in the office is not who's the best swordsman, who's the best horseman. It's the guy that can write the best essay. It's recruitment by the examination. And it's an incredible thing that the hero is the guy that can write and study. The sunbi is the hero in Korean culture, as opposed to the samurai. And I think all the other cultures of the world fall somewhere in between, mostly closer to the samurai culture, the knights. But Korea has this thing where, and as adjunct to point number 7, is the idea that Korea had a very, very short-lived feudal system. Very often people will talk about in the old days, and they'll say Pongon Shide, back in the feudal era. Well, the feudal era, if there was one, was late Shilla and early Koryo, but not much beyond that, because Korea developed a centralized state, and recruitment for the centralized state was not which daimyo could defeat the other daimyo in regional battles. It was who could write the best essay. And recruitment for government service was by the pen was mightier than the sword, I like to say, in Korean history. And the Japanese have said, with the domination of Japan, see, in the early 1900s, Japan was, of course, correct. They were more powerful. They conquered Korea. So the Japanese point of view is the correct point of view, and your Koreans are all out to lunch. And you Koreans have never had a good feudal system like we Japanese have. And we Japanese, like the Europeans, have had a good feudal system, but you Koreans, you haven't developed that yet. You know, they were seeing that Korea was underdeveloped, whereas the opposite is the truth. Korea had developed a centralized state that was much more advanced than the Japanese feudal state already anyway. Well, that's point number 7. Point number 8 is continual control of the government by the civilian authorities, not the military authorities, and keeping the military authorities in line. Where's Ned when we really need him? Ned went off to do research on the Big Island, but you know, Ned's research on the military takeover of the early Koryo is a very, very interesting example, because that military takeover that was virtually the same as the Japanese had done. They left the king on the throne and the military had the power, the bakufu kind of control. That disappeared in Korea after 80 years. You know, been there, done that. That's not the way to do it. Civilian control of the government is the way to do it. And the way you control a civilian government is you give the military an appropriate role and make sure that they're happy, so they don't come riding out of the bushes saying death to all civilians the way they did at the start of the military takeover, the Che government takeover in Koryo. But most of you probably don't know this, but of the 250 counties in Korea, half of them were given to military men. They were not military districts. They were not border districts. They were scattered throughout the country fairly evenly. But every other county had a magistrate assigned from the central government, not the local authority, but assigned from the central government. Half of those men had passed the military exam, half had passed the civil exam. And the military exam passers could work their way up through the system, and a scant handful of them became prime minister. Most of the prime ministers were from the civilian part. And you all know, do you, that the word Yangban, you know, means the two sides, the Yangban. And the two sides are the military and the civilian side. And the way Korea was able to control that and maintain control of that is really a marvelous thing. And as an adjunct to point number, what are we on? That's number 8. As an adjunct to that, let me just flip this up here for a second so you can see where we've been and where we're going for just a second. Yeah, the civilian control of the court. As an adjunct to that point is the control of the eunuchs. The Japanese history is replete with the story of the eunuchs controlling the court, because the emperor was raised by a bunch of eunuchs in the court. And as he got older, who do you trust? You can't trust anybody. Who's going to poison you? You know, you'd never know at the court. And the only people you can trust were the eunuchs. And so some of the emperors actually turned over the running of the court to the eunuchs. When the Japanese invaded in 1592, they informed the Chinese that they were on their way to China, and they were going to take over China. And the Ming court debated what to do about this. And the Wanli emperor, the Manduk emperor of China at that point, was not presiding. His eunuchs were. The Wanli emperor is the most famous example of the decadent emperor in the history of the world. He weighed somewhere around 400 pounds. He got so fat and so decadent that he had to have attendants to help him to move. And his job was wine, women, and song, maybe not in that order. And Japanese invading, don't bother me. Where are the grapes? You know, isn't it time for my afternoon orgy? You know, this was the Wanli emperor, and the eunuchs were controlling the court. The Korea had eunuchs, but they never got out of control the way the eunuchs of China did. Point number 5, slavery. The longest unbroken chain of slavery in the world is in Korea. Now, everything that I've shown you up to this point is something you can interpret as a positive thing, something that Koreans can be proud of. You've got the best this or that. You've also got the best slavery system in the world. because this unbroken chain of aristocracy from Shilla through Koryo through Chosun meant that the lower classes, the chain there was unbroken. And there was nothing that freed the slaves. Who are the slaves? The Chinese character for slave means prisoner of war. And every country that has slavery, it originated as prisoners of war. Even American slavery. The American slaves that were purchased out of Africa, you don't have British slave traders running through the jungle, grabbing guys by the ankle and putting them on the boat. You have the British slave traders going to the African king saying, hey, have you captured any slaves in your battles lately? Do you have any prisoners of war that you could sell us as slaves? And the African potentates would sell off prisoners. And it became so lucrative for them, they'd go and capture more prisoners, and they got into more war than they would have just for the sake of war, for the sake of the commercialization of American slavery, New World slavery. Well, Korean slavery also began as prisoners of war. Remember the three kingdoms fighting. And as one kingdom would conquer another, they'd enslave the losers. And sometimes, eventually Shilla won, but there were battles where Shilla lost, and some of the Shilla soldiers became slaves to Paekje, slaves to Koguryo. Well, Shilla comes back and conquers Paekje. They don't free the slaves, they make them their slaves. One of the few records we have of the Shilla period is of one man who owned 3,000 slaves. So slavery begins with the Shilla period, with this warfare. And then once unified Shilla settles into this long, peaceful thing that we're talking about, there was never anything sufficient to free the slaves. And the descendants of slaves become slaves, running from Shilla through Koryo, through Chosun. So that's the longest unbroken chain of slavery. And it's something that Korea is not proud of, but it's the flip side of the coin of the stability of the aristocracy. It's another indication, it's another piece of evidence of this long, peaceful, stable society that I've been arguing for. Point number 10 on the top 10 list is my favorite one, frankly, because I figured it out. I figured it out. The question is, why in the heck are there so many Kims? Why are there so many Kims, E's, and Poks? You all know the question, but none of you have the answer, I don't think. Somebody said, well, there were a lot of slaves, and Pak, Kim, and they're the old slave group. That's not true. Some of them were true, but the slaves took the names of other owners as well. And so the distribution of slaves per surname group is roughly the same as the distribution of surnames before the 20th century and the absorption of the slaves. In other words, you still had a lot of Kims, you still had a lot of E's, you still had a lot of Poks. Why? The Korean answer is, ho, 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 yeah, you throw a rock off of Namsan and you're gonna hit a Kim, E, or a Pak. There's no explanation. There's just this anecdote of throwing rocks, you'll hit a Kim, E, or a Pak. The question is why in the world are there so many Kims? And the name of my YouTube channel is The Frog Outside the Well. And it's a play on the idea of the Korean, Chinese, Japanese concept of the frog in the well, meaning you're not looking at the big picture, you're looking at a pretty narrow perspective. The Koreans say, umurane keguri. The Japanese say, what is the view of the ocean from a frog in the well? They had that ocean bit about it. Well, my YouTube channel is The Frog Outside the Well. And I'm really pleased with it. In a sense, I'm sort of being a smartass. You know, and people would say, "Oh, you're the frog outside. Well, you think you know everything," but my Korean audience likes it. They say, "Oh yeah, you're not a Korean. You're an outsider. You give a different perspective. That's okay." And so I had nothing but positive response on my YouTube channel about the name of my channel. But the point I'm getting at is, if you're the frog outside the well, if you look at the question for Koreans, why are there so many Kims? Why are there so many E's? Why are there so many Poks? Why is 21% of the population Kim? Why is 15% E? Why is 9% Pak? what's going on? And most Koreans say, yeah, isn't that something? Yeah, we've got a lot of Kims. And one of the answers you'll get is, oh, they're not all the same. They have different Pongwan. There's Kim Hye Kim and Kyungju Kim. So it is not the same. It's different. Kim is Kim, but not Kim is Kim. So Kim's not Kim. So, it's a different thing. So, so the question is, why are there so many Kims, Is, and Poks? The answer is what I've been telling you today about the smooth transitions from dynasty to dynasty, that nothing ever happened to disrupt the royal lines. Kim, Yi, and Pak are royal names from Kaya, from Shilla, and from the Chosun dynasty. And the Chosun Yi family goes back to Sorobo. They're one of the families of the 6 villages of Sorobo. Okay, how did I come upon this? At school one day, about 10 years ago, met a Yu Hak-sang from Japan, and a Japanese female student. And I said, oh, what's your name? She said, Fujiwara. I said, Fujiwara? Fujiwara? That's one of the royal names from the Heian period. And she blushed. Oh, yeah, my family name. Yeah. And then she said, and this is the key. This is what opened the door for me. She said, there aren't many of us left. They killed us all off. And that's what happens in other countries. When the dynasty ends, they kill off the royalty. In Korea, when the dynasties ended, they did not kill off the royalty, because the royalty continued on into the next generation, into the next dynasty, into the next dynasty. Why are there so many Kims, Is, and Poks in Korea? Because Korea has remarkably stable, long, peaceful history. That's my top 10 list. I added 2 more. As I thought about it after I had my top 10 list out, I found 2 more, and I call these my 12 pillars. I did a video on this, and I've got a picture of a house, a Korean house with, you know how the Korean house, they build the pillars and the roof before they put the walls on? Well, there's a house with in that stage of just the pillars, and there's 12 pillars, 3 by 4, 12 pillars, 12 pillars of Korean culture. So the number 11 is no religious wars. If you're a world historian and you've studied world history here and there and everywhere, and you look at Korea, you expect maybe, well, Korea, let's look at Korean history. What kind of religious wars have you had? You've got Buddhism, and you've got Confucianism here, and they could not be more different. Buddhism, you shave your head, you live in the mountains, you leave family, you meditate, you're concentrated on Satori and Nirvana. Confucianism, none of that crap. It's all relationships, the 5 relationships, the 3 bonds. It's all interconnection. It's government, it's society. It couldn't be any more different. The 2 religions could not be any more different. So the world history historian coming in knew from outside, aha, I bet you we got some real wars here between the Buddhists and Confucians, right? Wrongo bongo. There's no war. The 2 got along just famously. And that what one didn't do, the other one did, and they got along just fine. So the fact there have been no religious wars, where everywhere else, Northern Ireland, the Catholics and the Protestants can't even get along. They're all supposed Christians, but they can't get along. You got the jihadists among the Islamists. You got the history of the Crusades. The Christians are going to go down and slaughter the infidel and all this sort of stuff. None of that in Korea. So that's another mark on the stable, peaceful history of Korea. The final item I've got, pillar number 12, is rapid recovery from war. And the reason I've got this one is my dissertation work was on the revival, the renewal, the change of Confucianism in Korea in the late 17th, 18th century. You all know this is the Korean society that you knew in Korea, male-dominated, chokbo with the male line. The males are in charge of the ceremonies, the ancestral ceremonies, all male. This all stuff only began in the late 17th century. Before that time, Confucianism was open, and sons and daughters had equal inheritances in the household. Ceremonies were taking place on a rotational basis. Sons and daughters would take their turns doing these ceremonies. This idea of the dominance of the patriarchy took place in the late 17th century. Now, the problem is a lot of people say, oh yeah, there were all these social changes after the Hideyoshi invasion. Implication was the Hideyoshi invasion caused these social changes. Wrongo bongo, that's completely wrong, because these social changes, economic takeoff, monetization, starting to use currency, changes in inheritance where daughters are disinherited, changes in the ancestor system where sons do it and no longer rotation with the daughters, the development of the Chipsangchon, the surname village where everybody in the village had the same surname. These things are all late 17th century, early 18th century times. And if people say, oh, that's all a result of the Hideyoshi invasion, you're missing it by 80 years. That's wrong. And it gives the Japanese credit for starting this war that shook up Korea. No. What happened was after the Japanese invasion, Korea put itself back together. King Sunjo, when he left Seoul because the Japanese were coming and went up to the Shinriju, to the borderland where he was protected, when he left Seoul, they threw rocks at him. You know, you fake king, who the heck do you think you are, running off, leaving us here to fight? And but he came back, and the aristocracy came back, and the slaves came back. We talked about the long unbroken chain of slavery. Hideyoshi invasion, society was turned upside down. Now is the time for slaves to become free. No way. Slaves went back and became slaves again. And the point of the Hideyoshi invasion, the restoration of the Hideyoshi invasion, was restoration came first. All of these social changes came afterward. Then I started looking at Korea today. And Korea, after the Korean War, first restored itself. And you go back, you have the restoration of the Confucian social order, the male-dominated order. And it's only been in recent years that we've seen the change of the family registration from males only, where females now can be family heads. And the son preference was so dominant in the mid-90s that we were aborting female fetuses like crazy so that we could have a male heir. All of that's changed. And it didn't change right after the Korean War. It's changed 60 years after the Korean War. And the changes after Hideyoshi changed after Hideyoshi, not as a result of Hideyoshi. So my point is, pillar number 12 is restoration. Korea has tremendous ability to restore. We see it today in this dynamic, prosperous Korea that Korea has become, very different from the Korea that we all knew in 1966. By the way, I got there in 1965. I was ahead of you all by about 6 months. But the Korea we used to know, you know, that grindingly poor Korea revived and changed. And they did it after the Hideyoshi invasion. And they did it after the Mongol invasion. They first restored the order, and then they changed the order by establishing the Chosun dynasty. So point number 12 is Korea is dang good at restoring social order after chaos. Those are my 12 pillars. I'll post them again so you can do a screenshot if you want to, if you haven't had it. But I welcome your comments.
Wow, that was fascinating, Mark. I'm sure there's some questions.
I'll take this down so I can see you. Raise your hand or turn off your mic or turn on your mic or whatever. David.
Hi, I'm unmuted. Thanks so much. It was just wonderful to listen to your summary of the history. It really was good. I thought, for one thing, of the Shijo poem by Zhang Chao and the encounter between a Confucian officer of the court and the Buddhist monk.
Hey,
and
monk.
How, you know, Zhang Chao shouts out, "Stop right there! You know, where are you going?" And he points at the clouds and keeps on his way. And I'd never thought of it as, I'd always thought of it as Zhang Chao sort of letting us see himself get caught and put down by this monk, but actually picking up on what you were saying, it's a connecting again, and they're going different ways, but you know, still part of one social fabric. The thing I wanted to ask you about though, Mark, is given this sense of Korea as really a unified culture what comments might you have about North and South these days?
Yeah, yeah. Well, the first thing is if Korean dynasties last 500 years, we got a long way to go. the, the North Korean dynasty is all set up. You know, I gave a talk at BYU in 92 or something and said, when Kim Il-sung dies, the new man won't last 6 months. Tell what I know. And now we've got grandson, you got Junior on the throne, and you know, he seems to be 3 sheets to the wind and doesn't know what he's doing, and yet, you know, they've got the ruling place in the ruling order in place. But you know, one day North Korea is going to fall, and it's going to fall the way Eastern Europe did overnight. It's just going to come crumbling down. Either somebody, my dream scenario is that a fellow with a gun, it's got to be a military guy who's close to Kim Jong-un, says enough of this nonsense. I'm going to eliminate this guy. Boom. And he will become the greatest hero in modern Korean history, because he will turn around and say, now let's work out a unification process. If somebody in North Korea gets that idea and does that, we could have a peaceful unification, a step-by-step unification. That's my dream. That's my hope for what happens in Korea. Very much for my dream of a Caesarean solution to the Putin problem. You know, we passed March 15th, but we can have another day. Yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question about North Korea? It's more of a question than an answer, I suppose.
Oh, but it's getting there. Good. Thanks.
Yeah, this woman down here, whose name is Frank Consilis.
I think
What's
it's
your real name?
Francine. Francine, go ahead.
Fine. Okay. When and why did the hereditary slaves become not slaves?
Well, yeah, good question. In 1894, there were no more slaves. So after that, everybody was free, right? It's like the emancipation of the American slaves. Slavery lasts on for generations. When I was living in Samcheong-dong, when I was first in Korea in 1965, 6 months ahead of all y'all, we had a helper next door who we were looking for someone to help with our laundry. And this guy next door says, oh, I've got a maid who could come in and do your laundry. And we agreed on a price and all of this. And then we found out later on that she wasn't getting the money. She was only getting part of it. And we confronted him about it. He said, well, she's my slave. What do you want? And this was 1965. Now, and in the same way, the slavery in the South transformed into sharecropping, which in some ways was not even better than slavery. Slavery in Korea was emancipated officially in 1894, but it took a while. And in fact, when you and I were in Korea in 1966, you know how snobby some Koreans were about social class. And oh dear, you can't date her. She's from a slave background. Oh, have you checked on the family background of that person? You can't marry that guy. Have you done his genealogy? You know, so the idea of social class, you know, it's starting to fade a lot now. My favorite anecdote in this regard was when I was Fulbright director, we had a maid that helped us out, and she came in one day and said, hey, can I get the day off tomorrow? I said, sure, what's up? She said, I'm going to my son's graduation from school. Oh, where's he graduating? I think it was Jungan, if I remember right. And what's he graduating in? Oh, he's got a medical degree. And this maid couldn't take a phone message because she wasn't literate enough to get 7 phone numbers down. We'd come home sometime and she'd say, somebody, Kim, called, here's his number, it's 384256. There weren't enough numbers to call him back. And so this illiterate woman had a son who's graduated from medical school. And so I think the open educational system of Korea that has, you know, taken place in recent years is the great liberator of the slave social class.
Mark, I have a question.
Yes, Carl.
One's a question, a second a comment. You started out with the shrimp gets its back broken in the fight between the whales.
And I said,
And,
that's no more, right? Okay.
Well, no, what I've got for you is what they say in Nepal, which is a yam gets crushed between two boulders. And in that case,
Mhm.
it's India and China. But I just had one comment, and what you said about the slaves reminded me, and this was after K1 was in Korea. This was the mid 70s. I had the experience of being out in the countryside, actually near Hawaii, and meeting an old woman who told me that her family belonged to the people who lived in the house up on the hill. That especially out in the countryside, these former slave master relations didn't really change until the old generation died off. My comment is about what you have about invasions, and I know that when you're making 10 or 12 points, you emphasize the main point and don't shade it very much. But I think when you're looking at invasions, and if you're going to take the Hideyoshi invasion and pillaging and killing the population and stealing everything as the definition of invasion, you're right, not very many. But when I think the Korean view of, and this is the shrimp between whales, is in what we might call the modern era of the last 150, 200 years, even though they weren't specifically an invasion of Korea, the Sino-Japanese War, and then the Russo-Japanese War, which is a lot more than the Battle of Tsushima. The Japanese forces fought the Russians in northern Korea back, and up to, what was it, Port Arthur. And so I just think that if you look at more recent history, Koreans can say they've been a country vulnerable to large outside powerful military
Yeah.
forces, even if those military forces were fighting each other. So I would just say, I understand what you're doing, but I thought that point was, to me, was a little overdrawn, especially
Well-
for Korea. The Koreans' view is what's happened recently. That always, as you say, the liquid fills the container, and it's what's happened recently and what might happen, which was, the invasion from North Korea can be seen as a civil war, but I think South Koreans today views that as an invasion of them, and they're worried about an invasion in the future, whether it's by fellow Koreans or not.
Well, and one aspect of what I'm saying is the militarists don't like it, because the militarists like to say, we've been invaded so many times in the past, we'll never be invaded again. We've got to be tough, and everybody's got to serve in the army and that sort of stuff. So the militarists don't like my point of view either. But I think my response is that Korea has been beaten up by the 20th century, and Korea definitely has a piheja chengshin, a victimization attitude, and they deserve it because they have been victimized in the 20th century. No question about that. But I'm saying, let's leave the 20th century behind for a while and look at the long history of the war, and it's a long history of the country, and it's a glass half empty, glass half full situation, granted. But I'm going to emphasize my side of it, because the other side certainly had enough of its emphasis along the way. Charlie, you had your hand up.
Muted, Charlie.
Charlie, you got to unmute.
Sorry about that. Mark, you mentioned the year, I think 1910 or so, the early 1900s, when the Japanese came in, and you mentioned that it wasn't really an invasion, but it was much more subtle and with some cooperation. Could you give us some more details about what actually happened back then?
Well, yeah, that's not my period, but roughly, have Ed Baker tell you about it. He's worked on the Japanese era, but just roughly in a nutshell, the Japanese beat up the Chinese, as Carl was just saying, then they beat up the Japanese, and there was nobody left to argue Korea's interests, and the Americans sold out. The Koreans that are anti-American they got a lot of grist in the mill. The Americans have not been so sweet to Koreans over the years. And the famous Katsuta-Taft agreement, where William Howard Taft, Secretary of State, agreed that if Japan would keep its hands off the Philippines, the United States would keep its hands off of Korea. That was 1905 and thereafter. And so Korea was declared a protectorate by Japan in 1905, which means Japan took over Korea's foreign affairs, which means that when King Kojong, who didn't like that, wanted to do something about it, sent 3 emissaries to an international conference at The Hague in the Netherlands to claim that Korea did not want to be protected by Japan. And the Japanese, the Hague refused to seat the 3 Korean delegates. And as a result, the Japanese unseated King Kojong and put his hapless son on the throne that they manipulated for 3 more years until they out and out annexed Korea by getting the prime minister of Korea, Lee Won-yong, to sign a document giving Korea to Japan. Lee Won-yong's descendants moved to the States and to North America. Many of you know Don Baker, who teaches history at the University of British Columbia, Ed's younger brother, by a different mother and a different father. Don Baker told me one time that one of the students in his class, a Canadian Korean, came up to him, and after all the other students had left, he went up and he said, "I should tell you, but don't tell anyone else. I'm the great grandson of Lee Won-yong." And so it's a matter of shame, that these people sold out Korea. But where was the war in 1910? There was no war. The war was in 1919, once Korea declared its independence from Japan, once they got enough people to realize they'd been snookered. But the Japanese, they're as good as the white man in America. They're going to come in and they're going to help this poor benighted bunch of redskins and help this underdeveloped Korea to develop. And the Japanese, by cracky, they did a lot of good things. I mean, they opened education to everybody, not just the elite, men and women as well. And healthcare improved, life span improved. All these wonderful things happened under the Japanese, which gave footing to the pro-Japanese faction that said, yeah, this Japanese thing, that's cool, these Japanese. And we got rid of the old monarchy. And we're now a democracy. Koreans didn't give up the monarchy to become part of a Japanese monarchy. They became part of the Japanese democracy, don't you know? And Koreans were elected to office. And there were Koreans that ran for office not only in Korea, but ran for office in Japan. And so the Japanese takeover, the Koreans tend to tell you all of the bad side of it, but it was very subtle the way the thing snuck in and took over. And then when the Japanese start their imperialist wars in Manchuria in 1931 and in China in 1937 is when 3 things really went ugly. The Japanese period, the things that we heard about it in 1966 was the Japanese came in and we all had to use Japanese names. Well, you didn't have to use your Japanese name until 1937. And Korean was taught as a foreign language in Korea, which was a shameful thing that, Korean was a foreign language. But that didn't happen until the 1937 period too. So the periodization of the Japanese period is an important thing to keep in mind when you look at how the Japanese did it. Did I get it right, Ed?
Sounded good to me.
I have a question.
Diane.
Okay, let's see. This is Diane Odell. Okay.
Your comments about the Koreans having this identity as a victimhood, and that was certainly apparent when we were there in '66, because they used to talk about that only pure Koreans could have survived and put up with how awful things were in Korea. So that it was a turn it around, things are so awful, but we are superior in our characters and our personal strength that we can survive this. And Kevin O'Donnell, someplace about the end of the first year, maybe a little bit sooner, said that he was getting incredible pushback from Koreans in the government in Seoul that they wanted us to have foreigner commissary and all kinds of other privileges, because the fact that we were living on the Korean economy without these extras, we were eating Korean food and thriving. And was that,
Tough as they were.
yeah, that suddenly we were pushing that national myth of only pure Koreans could write Hangul. Only pure Koreans could like Korean food, and only pure Koreans could live through either the heat of the summer or the pour of the winter when we were living in the villages and so on. And he said it was a very interesting twist on that, but that he held the mark and said no. So do you have any comments about that, Mark, or do you see any of that sort of thing as more foreigners came in?
Well, that's a really interesting thing, because the foreigners early on, man, to get on the base and get a hamburger, wow, what a treat that was. And oh, in the old days, you could walk right into the embassy. Do you ever walk right into the embassy and walk right through the dining room? You could just walk right in and order all this American food. And I remember that was a great treat after, Korean food all the time. Yeah, that's interesting.
Those of us who walked into the Siemens Club in Busan a couple of times heard a leader from Seoul that was not to happen anymore. It was made very clear that if a Korean man on the street could not walk into someplace, we could not either.
We didn't do it very often, but once in a while, like once a month. It was a great treat. A hamburger and a milkshake once a month is to die for, So no, we didn't have our Kevin O'Donnell tell us no more, never, forever, but no, we lived on the Korean economy as well. When I first went to Korea, we ate.
Pushback? Did you get any of that pushback from Koreans?
Saying that only they could do that and we couldn't?
Kind of subtly encouraging you to do more American things?
No, I don't think I've noticed that. I don't know. One thing about our experiences, all of our experiences, was that we tapped into a personality strain and a cultural strain that was just remarkable. However Koreans define it, however they, what they've been through, and the privations, the deprivations that they've suffered, and these days, a lot of my Korean friends are concerned about China. And the anti-Chinese sentiment today is stronger than the anti-Japanese sentiment in a lot of quarters, because they don't like what China is trying to do about co-opting their culture and claiming that the hanbok and the kimchi are actually Chinese. And Korean young people are really upset about this kind of nonsense. But my response to that is Koreans speak Korean. And that says a lot, because language is the core of all culture. Whatever culture, whatever you eat, whatever you wear, language is the key element. And the fact that the Mongols were beaten up and they're a nothing country today, sorry, Mongols. But, and the Manchus have been completely absorbed. There are a few villages in Manchu in Northeast China where they speak a Manchu dialect. The Manchus were completely Sinified. And so the fact that Koreans speak Korean means that Koreans have held on to their culture no matter what. And they're fiercely proud of their kimchi and their hanbok, and by golly, the Chinese can't have it. So that's my take on that. Let's see, I see the name Michael Travis.
Yeah, two comments. First of all, the greatest culture shock I had was going on to the 8th Army post when I was in Daegu. After being there for a year, I never had such culture shock in my life, even returning back to the US. Secondly, after about 6 months of living with a wealthy Korean family, I decided that I should live as a Chonggak Sansang, and that required that I have a hasuk. And I had extreme difficulty getting my first hasuk. But I got around that problem by taking my students with me and having them vouch for me that, yes, I can sleep on an aldobang, yes, I can eat Korean food, and yes, I can go to the Pyeonso.
But would
And
you
so
take your
after-
shoes off in the house?
Yeah, and so after the first hasuk that I had, it was easy to get the next ones because all I had to do is say, go talk to Mrs. Kim or Miss Lee.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
Koreans were extraordinarily hospitable, even as they were dirt poor.
Yeah.
I went to a dinner hosted by one of my college students in my college conversation club, and I had eaten at 2 other dinners.
Yeah.
And their family was dirt poor, but they had made a banquet for me.
Yeah.
And I had to force myself, literally force myself, and become almost to the point of throwing up. I had
Yeah.
to eat food. Yeah.
Yep. We've all been through that, the tremendous generosity of the Koreans.
Yes.
Bobby, your
Yeah.
hand's up.
I could add a comment to that. My American Japanese daughter lives in Seoul, and her family just has gotten through COVID. She got so much backup from her Korean friends. It's unbelievable. It would never have happened in Japan. They got to send her things to eat. They went and got her medicine for her. That wasn't what I wanted to say though. When you were talking about slaves, here we get a lot of the Korean historical movies, and I like them very much. And Pekchun come up very frequently. Are Pekchun the same as slaves? Or are slaves people who we see in those little drab uniforms working in the palace and for wealthy people? What are the slaves back then?
Well, there were 2 kinds of slaves, basically. There were the field slaves and the household slaves, and they could be interchanged. A field slave can be moved into the house, a household slave can be moved into the field. The household slaves would live in the complex with the owner. The field slaves would often live in remote places. The land system was fractured such that a person who held 100 whatever of land would have 20 here and 5 there and 10 there and 20 there and 15 there. They were scattered all over the whole peninsula. And they'd have different slaves that would work some of their land, and they'd have slaves that would work other people's land, and they would have other people's slaves that would work their land. And they had a complicated rent system where everybody would pay rent as slaves and rent on the land. So, you know, when I first went to Korea, I heard that there were Yangban and Sangnom. And then when I went to graduate school, I found out there were 3 classes. There were Yangban and Yangmin, you know, free people who were not slaves. And then there were the Chunmin, the slaves. Well, I've since decided that there are really only 2 systems, because the slaves intermarried with the commoners. The intermarriage between commoners and slave was rampant. The intermarriage between Yangban and commoners was non-existent, except for the secondary wife, the concubine of the aristocrat. So the line between Yangban and commoners and slaves, between Yangban and the lower classes, was firm. The line between commoners and slaves was very fudgeable. And Yangban slave owners wanted their slaves to intermarry with a commoner because that would bring them more workers into their network. So you talk about the slaves in the palace. That was one thing. And you asked earlier about abolition of slavery. Koreans evolved out of slavery. They abolished official slavery, that is to say, government office slavery in 1801, which parallels with the 1801 American decision to import no more slaves. You know, the Americans didn't import any slaves after 1801. Interesting, you got a parallel situation in Korea. So they got rid of government slaves and they switched to a wage economy in Korea, which frankly, in a lot of ways is more exploitative than slavery. Because wage, you just pay the wage and get out of here. But slavery, you have to take care of the children, you have to take care of the old people, and it's a much more burden on the owner than just paying a wage.
Well, where does Pekchun?
Pekchung were the lowest of the slaves. Korea, if it doesn't have a pecking order, doesn't have anything. Even among slaves, you've got a pecking order, and the Pekchung were the lowest order of the slaves. The Pekchung were the meat butchers and the tanners, the hide tanners, and those kinds of things. So they violated all the Buddhist norms of killing and taking care of meat. And
They're kind of an outcast
yeah,
group.
yeah, yep.
Okay, thank you.
Don. Unmute, Don. There we go.
Thank you. Now, I was thinking about the comments that my brother made about the election. And
The recent election?
Yeah, recent election.
Yeah.
And one of the things he said was because, is it Yoon who won?
Yeah.
Yeah, he is from Gyeongsangdo.
Yeah.
He is from Jeollado or Baekje.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know whether that, it might tie in with your.
Oh
theory.
yeah, definitely. The Kim Dae-jung Chollado thing is still very, very strong in Korea today. Yeah, and you all heard it. Those of you that were in Chollado, if you didn't hear it so much, but if you're in Gyeongsangdo, you heard how terrible Chollado people were, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it lives on.
So my brother thinks that people voted for Yoon because he's from Gyeongsangdo,
Yeah.
not from Jeollado.
Yeah, that was a lot of it. And you look at the voting percentages, it's very high for that party in Gyeongsangdo, very high for the other party in Chollado. Yeah. Yeah, indeed.
Well, Mark, we usually have a breakout room, but your presentation was much too interesting to do that. I think we could have one more quick question, and then we should let you off the hot seat.
There's Ed Klein. Ed?
Yeah, just there's a couple of things that were said that weren't, in my way of thinking, completely right. Not by you, but by some of my fellow volunteers. It was in, I think, maybe the second semester of our being in Korea that the Korean government put out these little bitty commissary things for foreigners. And it is not true that we were forbidden to go in there or anything like that. We actually got a little bit of a amount of money to spend in it, like $25 or something for a period, because I can remember the thing that.
Have you?
Is that not true?
No, not commonly widely known. No, maybe
Never heard of it.
We didn't.
Are you kidding me? It was
No.
right down the street from
We
me.
are not kidding you, Ed. We never heard of it.
Never heard of it.
We absolutely had access to the foreigners commissary once it was established. There was one in Busan and we went to it we were living in Ulsan at the time. And I can remember, I'm sure I was told that Kevin finally approved it and Lauren disapproved. He didn't want us to have it, but yes, we were allowed to do it. We were still not allowed to go to the Siemens Club, but we still went to the Siemens Club. And yes, I understand the cheeseburger phenomenon, Mark, absolutely. But it was a cheeseburger, not a hamburger.
So maybe it was a Busan thing.
No, it was in Gwangju. We had it in Gwangju. I can see it on the street on Kumnamno. It was right there. And it was a tiny thing and they had practically nothing in it, but they did carry small bottles of whiskey, as I remember. And I think my $5 or $10 of allowance sort of went for that and for some camping trips or something. Yeah, no, I'm sure. And also remember the first Thanksgiving, which was not long after we got there. Kevin, I think, got the thing where the military invited us and our families to go for a Thanksgiving dinner at the nearest military base.
Yeah.
And that was that was very funny, seeing my Korean brothers and sisters try to maneuver knife, fork, and spoon because it was their first time to do that.
We did have that, so we can say, yes, we did do Thanksgiving on an army base, yeah.
And that's interesting because we in Busan were invited, and Frank, you probably remember this, we were invited by the guy who was the head of the USIS who had kind of adopted us. And he definitely gave us the impression that he had engineered it. And we had dinner with the commandant of the base, whose family had just gone back to the United States, and families were not included. Our Korean families were not included.
Well, there's the
Our
Black
Korean
Mountain.
family was included, and they loved everything until they found out that the dessert, even though they loved the pie, as soon as we said it was hobak pie, then they decided they didn't like it. Hobak was peasant food.
I don't
Well,
like it
Hobak is
either. That must be why I
fashionable
don't like it.
Pumpkin pie.
Hobak is very fashionable now. We have Hobak juk
Oh,
at very upper class restaurants nowadays.
Yeah.
Hey, and there was
I
the
like
Black.
whipped cream.
Pie is loved by every Korean we've fed it to.
Someone told me I should start a business in Seoul or in Korea selling hobak pies.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it sounds
Did
like
you serve whipped cream with it,
Oh, yeah.
Diane? Whipped cream?
Yeah.
That's the only part I like is the whipped cream.
Yeah,
okay, maybe at a later time we can talk about all this diversity among the Peace Corps experiences in terms of things like that. But Mark, I want to thank you. That was just fascinating.
Great.
It was just really great, and we're recording it, and we'll make it available to Ned Schultz, of course, and to everyone else. Okay, so thanks, Mark. Let's give Mark a round of applause.
Thank you. Nice
And-
to see you.
And
David,
as an honorary K1, please continue to come back occasionally, at least, if not
Yeah,
always.
I'd like that. I enjoy this. We're all the same age, right?
Right.
Well, I don't know about you, but
Okay, well, thanks again, Mark. I'm gonna stop the recording.